morning, everyone. My name is David Loy. I am the legal director for the ACLU Foundation of San Diego and Imperial Counties. Together with Iredale and You, Pride Law Firm, Singleton Law Firm, law offices of Michael R. Marinan, Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance, and Coalition for Police Accountability and Transparency, we're convening this joint press conference to announce cases and claims against local law enforcement agencies. Welcome and thank you for being here to learn about this important issue, and thank you for sharing it with your audiences. We'll begin the press conference in a minute, but before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping matters. Please note that the press conference is being recorded and will be shared with the public. If you are having trouble hearing or seeing anything, please use the Zoom chat function to send us a message. The chat function is at the bottom of your screen, and our outstanding technical team will sort that out. Currently, all participants' microphones are muted. We'll take questions after speakers have completed their remarks. Once they're done, I'll provide more information on how to ask questions before we open it up to Q&A. We are, and the panelists will themselves be off video and muted while not speaking. Yes, the session is being recorded, and it is understood that everything is being recorded. We are here today because San Diegans deserve to live in communities that are safe, peaceful, and thriving. Far too long, the San Diego region has endured a pattern of biased law enforcement and excessive force against people of color, especially Black people. Today, we will hear multiple stories about people who are subjected to police violence while trying to voice legitimate concerns about police brutality and misconduct. Instead of lashing out against demonstrators and others, law enforcement agencies should be listening to the voices of the communities they serve and hear their concerns and frustrations. Among others, Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance and the ACLU Foundation of San Diego and Imperial Counties are actively listening to the community. My office, the ACLU Foundation of San Diego and Imperial Counties, recently launched a dedicated intake line in both English and Spanish to hear from community members about their experiences with law enforcement. The recent conduct of local law enforcement agencies has spotlighted the need for systemic change. For example, San Diego Police Department has continued to cite and arrest Black people disproportionately to their representation in the population, even as it reduced overall citations and arrests during the pandemic. Recently, it was reported the Sheriff's Department incorrectly analyzed its own data to claim data as to stops and arrests showed no bias. Local law enforcement responded to initial protests against police brutality and systemic racism with tear gas and projectile weapons. The problem is not only lack of police training and procedures and policies. Investing additional resources for training will not fix fundamentally broken policing institutions. We need to drastically reduce the role, responsibility, and presence of police in communities. We need to divest from police budgets and deepen investment of money and resources in community services and non-law enforcement interventions. We'll hear more about this later, but today's press conference brings together civil rights attorneys to explain the pattern of systemic abuses by local law enforcement and highlight cases that arise from recent misconduct. Each of the attorneys has long experience litigating these cases, and some have just filed claims or cases with local government for serious injuries recently caused by local law enforcement agencies. The attorneys will speak about their cases and connect them to the need for systemic changes in local law enforcement practices. Our speakers are Julia Yu, partner at Iredale and Yu, APC, Dante Pride, partner at the Pride Law Firm, Gerald Singleton, partner at Singleton Law Firm, Michael Meriden, attorney at law from law offices of Michael R. Meriden, and Genevieve Jones-Wright, executive director with Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance. Again, following conclusion of all comments, we will take questions. And now I will turn it over to Julia.
Thank you, David, and good morning. My name is Julia Yu. I am the incoming president of the National Police Accountability Project, the largest civil rights attorney organization in the country. I'm a partner at Iredale and Yu. Before my colleagues discuss their individual cases, I want to provide you with some background and context for the way that the cities and the county of San Diego have treated law-abiding and peaceful protesters over the past decade. Back in 2011, our firm represented 12 members of the Occupy movement who had been unlawfully arrested and brutalized by the San Diego Sheriff's deputies and the San Diego police officers. The Occupy movement involved peaceful citizens protesting the economic inequities in the country by occupying public spaces and encouraging dialogue about fairness and justice. On October 28, 2011, after midnight, the sheriff's deputies and San Diego police officers descended in full riot gear on sleeping Occupy members, corralling them and attacking them from behind as they were attempting to comply with the orders and leave the park. Some of these officers specifically targeted members of the LGBTQ community. Some of them targeted the most vulnerable people there, including teenagers and children. The sheriff's deputies then placed the women and the girls in a van, hours upon hours, denying them access to restrooms despite repeated requests by the women, forcing them to urinate and defecate in the vans in handcuffs. These methods of brutalizing and dehumanizing activists had an immediate impact, as most of the activists never returned to engage in the exercise of the First Amendment. Fast forward 9 years, and sadly, it appears that some of the departments have not learned from the past. There continues to be needless use of force on peaceful protesters. What we cannot have today is doubling down on our previous mistakes. We cannot have immediate escalation of force upon arrival of the officers. We cannot have this continued militarization of the police. We cannot have needless and indiscriminate use of projectiles and tear gas. And just lastly, I want to say that we are living in unprecedented times today. We have never seen this kind of activism across the country, and in particular in the county of San Diego. So to the young leaders out there protesting and organizing their peers, their parents, their neighbors, I just want to say you inspire all of us here today, and we support you, we hear you, and we thank you so much. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Julia. And now I will turn it over to Dante Pride.
Hello, thank you, David. Hello, my name is Dante Pride. I am the founding partner of the Pride Law Firm here in San Diego, California. And I'm honored to be here with so many great advocates and great attorneys. It's unfortunate the reason that we're here is because that we've had a reckoning has taken place. In December of December of 2019, I was on the news to speak about the numbers that we saw from policing when it comes to people of color as opposed to non-people of color. We found out that in San Diego specifically San Diego Police Department specifically, that African Americans are 7 times more likely to be pulled over, 7 times more likely to be arrested, but less likely to have contraband. So that told us that African Americans and people of color were being impacted by police in a manner that others just didn't have to deal with. I said it then, and I'm saying it now. We were screaming from the rooftops. People of color were screaming from the rooftops. Policing in this country is wrong. The manner in which we are treated, the manner in which we are handled is totally wrong and inappropriate. Fast forward to May of this year. In May of this year, we saw, the world got to see, the veil was pulled back, and we were able to see the policing that's been going on in communities, people of color, since as long as I can remember. As long as I've been on this earth, I've had to sustain and deal with aggressive policing. And what we have here is these aggressive police tactics are being used on the general public. Now I represent 4 individuals who were harmed tremendously by the use of these metal beanbag projectiles. People call them beanbags and less than lethal, and they are allegedly supposed to be less than lethal. However, the manner in which these things were used, shot indiscriminately in crowds, these were lethal metal beanbag rounds that were fired at people and my clients. My first client, Bethany Labarge, she was out at the protest, and she was hit 1.5 inches away from her pacemaker. She could have died. For what? For yelling at the police. She didn't throw, she wasn't looting, she wasn't burning. She was using her First Amendment right. She was speaking out against police violence and brutality. Next, there's Eric Woolsey. We have video of Mr. Woolsey simply holding a phone above his head. And yeah, he may have flipped the bird at the police, but the bird flipping at the police is not enough to be shot with a metal kinetic round such that he broke 2 of his fingers. We have video of that as well. Then we have Tyler Astoria, an 18-year-old boy was driving in his vehicle. He was driving down La Mesa Boulevard, and officers shot kinetic beanbags through the windows, causing him to have 7 staples in his head. That is very dangerous and very egregious. And then finally, and this is the client that has rocked the nation, and everyone has seen the tremendous damage that this metal beanbag caused. Leslie Furcroft, she was hit right between the eyes by a kinetic beanbag. Now she has multiple fractures in her face. She was growing her dreadlocks for nearly 10 years. She had to cut those off. She has no vision in her left eye. She has problems walking. She has problems remembering. She has problems with balance, all because she decided to come out as she is entitled to do in protest. These things we cannot stand for. These things I will not stand for. And I am hopeful that the community gets behind me and us and all of the great lawyers that are here today. And we all stand up together and say, no more. No more of this. No more policing aggressively. Now we are in a space and we are ready to move forward with litigation. And I look forward to the work, and I look forward to conferring with all of these great lawyers. Thank you. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Dante. And now I'll turn it over to Gerald Singleton.
Hi, David. Is my video on?
Now we see you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. I thought Dante really said all there was to say on the systemic issues. That was a great job of describing just what it is that we're facing here. I want to talk a little bit about my 2 clients because they don't fit the standard, for lack of a better term, civil rights client. Neither of them are what you picture when you picture people that are either at protests or that are injured in these types of events. Starting with our first client, Michelle Horton. She is a 51-year-old mother of 2. She was in the Navy. She's a healthcare worker. She's been interested in social justice all her life. And when her daughter, who's a senior in college, said that she wanted to go to the La Mesa protests on May 30, Ms. Horton didn't want her to go alone, so she volunteered to drive her down. She participated. She and her daughter stood in the protests, did not do anything illegal. Nothing they did was out of line, and they were engaging in their First Amendment protected activity. What happened after Dante's client, Ms. Furcron, was shot in the head is that the scene deteriorated, people got separated. So Ms. Horton went across the street to the Chevron station. She was standing there, she'd called her daughter, and her daughter was on her way to come meet Ms. Horton, and then they were gonna leave. Ms. Horton's about 5'2", she's unarmed, and she was not threatening or doing anything illegal. She's standing on the sidewalk. A police car pulls up, she puts her hands up to show that she's not threatening them in any way, and she shot with a rubber bullet in the left side of her breast, causing what she described as excruciating pain. Again, there is absolutely no justification for that. You've got a woman who had previously attended the protest, but was no longer at the protest. She's standing in front of a Chevron waiting for her daughter. She's, 5'0". She is the epitome of an unthreatening person, and yet she's shot. Switching gears to our other client, Miss Cassidy, she was at the protest the following day, and Miss Cassidy's younger, she's 28, she's a student at UCSD, and she has a long history of participating in social justice movements. She started a GoFundMe to raise money for some of the most vulnerable people who were affected by COVID. She also is very small in stature. She's unarmed. She's at the protest. She was actually trying to keep the peace. She was going back and forth and talking to different people saying, let's make sure that we don't do anything illegal. Let's not give the police cause to break this up. Let's express our viewpoints. And she also was shot in the rib. She thought she'd broken her ribs. Fortunately, they were not. But here again, she described the pain as excruciating. And I think the larger point here is this. While there's no question, both David and Dante were 100% correct that people of color are targeted and are much more likely to be stopped and to suffer abuse at the hands of the police, it's not limited. Anybody who embraces this movement is unfortunately, under the current police culture, viewed as an enemy, and they're treated accordingly. And one of the things that we're trying to do through this suit, and in addition to filing the two injury suits that we filed for violation of these two individuals' constitutional rights, we've also filed taxpayer suits to try and ban the use of these projectiles and the use of tear gas as a means of crowd control. As Dante said, it is absolutely inexcusable for police to use these rounds as a means of crowd control. There is a place for them in policing, but it's in very specific situations. You can't go around shooting unarmed people like Ms. Furcron, like the rest of Dante's clients, like our clients, who are peacefully protesting with these rubber bullets simply because they're categorized as less than lethal. They can be lethal. There are people who are killed by them every year. And more to the point, it's a violation of our most important constitutional right. The Bill of Rights lists the First Amendment first because it is the most important. When people are upset about something the government has done, they have every right to peacefully protest. And that was what was happening in both of these before, in the La Mesa incident, the police fired, shot, and severely injured Ms. Furcron, and then created a scene of chaos. So like Dante said, and like Julia said, I'm very happy to be a part of this, and we look forward to working together to bring change.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm going to turn this over to Michael Marinan, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. I think it's, in a way, I feel sad that we even have to be here today. I thought back over the last several weeks. I remember very well, I've been doing police abuse cases for over 25 years. And just about 25 years ago, a 16-year-old boy was killed when the San Diego police officers used what they call a carotid restraint, a type of chokehold. And at the time, there was a fair amount of community uproar, but it didn't last for long. And the one good thing that's come out of all this is that the police departments have finally said 25 years later that they're banning this dangerous and deadly type of chokehold. But the sad thing for me is it's taken 25 years, and it shouldn't take 25 years to make change that is clearly necessary. And we are in a time right now where that is the case. We are, I think it was Jerry who mentioned, and all have alluded to this, the culture of policing needs to change. And small reforms are not going to do the job. There have to be systemic cultural changes in policing. It is a culture of force and violence. And now we are seeing it on TV, live and in person. And I think when we see what we've seen over the last several months, I think that the community recognizes that this is unacceptable. And the departments have to be willing to transform themselves. In so many respects, they've lost the trust of the communities. And any police executive will tell you that policing can't succeed without the trust of the community. Parents should not be terrified that their African-American sons and daughters are subject to being injured or killed by the police when they go out. That is not a fear that any parent should have. And yet so many of our minority parents and their children, that's what they're afraid of, the police. And that needs to change. Over the many years and all of the cases that I've handled, hundreds and hundreds, including cases from the protests now, almost without exception, and I bet my colleagues would agree with me, the force and violence that was used was not necessary. De-escalation skills are appropriate, not escalation. And in almost every one of these injury and death cases, what we see is that de-escalation was not employed, escalation was. So that's part of the culture that needs to change. I think it is important to focus, as many community organizations have, on transparency in policing, in de-escalation, and in accountability. And what I've seen over the years is almost a complete lack of accountability. So many people don't know that in the last 5 years, there's been a very clear focus on de-escalation by police. They've all been trained in it. They're required to be trained in it now every other year. And yet, when they don't use those skills, which is way too often, there's no accountability. Nobody reprimands them. Nobody looks at it. That needs to change. We've heard a lot in recent weeks about an officer's obligation to intervene. The cases that you've heard talked about this morning, somebody should have intervened and said, stop using those rubber bullets, stop using tear gas, stop using chokeholds. You don't need to use force on nonviolent protesters. And that's been in the policies and that the duty to intervene and in the law for as long as I've been practicing. And I've never, ever seen an officer reprimanded or disciplined for failing to intervene. And most of them know that the culture in policing is you're not supposed to intervene when one of your colleagues is using force. And that needs to change. So finally, I do want to mention the civilian review boards. There is going to be an important initiative on the ballot in the fall to improve the Civilian Review Board at the city. There has been a Civilian Review Board at the county for several years, and a lot of effort was put into making that happen. The problem is, at the county, it was never properly funded, and it does not have the resources to do the job. It's not perfect by any means, but there has to be a commitment from the powers that be that these review boards are properly funded and that they are truly independent. Finally, I do want to mention one of the places that the greatest civil rights abuses and uses of force that are unnecessary happen is in our jails and prisons. And I don't think we should ignore that. That is a place where force and violence of the type that we see is unnecessary in almost every case. And that needs to stop. And the complaints that citizens have, too often the San Diego Police Department, the sheriffs, and others refuse to investigate complaints that citizens file. And that needs to change. Every complaint needs to be investigated. And I always cringe when I hear the word, well, we'll investigate. That's not good enough. There has to be action taken after the investigation. And that's something that also needs to change. So I think this is a time when we really have an opportunity to make a difference. We want to work in partnership with our police agencies, because what do we want? We want people who are not afraid of the police. We want our citizens, all of our citizens, treated with dignity and respect by the police. And at the end of the day, we want to put a stop to unnecessary injuries and deaths at the hands of the police. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'll turn it over to Genevieve Jones-Wright.
It's telling me that I'm unable to start the video because the host has stopped it. If I can be given the ability. Thank you. My name is Genevieve Jones-Wright. I am the Executive Director of Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance, also known by the community as MOGO. I am also a member of CPAT, the Coalition for Police Accountability and Transparency. CPAT is a group of diverse community members, faith leaders, and labor stakeholders who are committed to addressing disparities present in policing practices in the Black, Latino, API, and other communities that have been impacted by over-policing. This pandemic has acted as a magnifying glass on our societal ills relating to race and how race along with income are health determinatives. More so, this pandemic has been a magnifying glass for race relations and community police relations. The world that civil rights and defense attorneys like me and the others you heard from moments ago have been seeing and experiencing for decades now is a world that many more citizens of the world now see. There has always been this reality of two Americas. One America that calls 911 and feels safe knowing officers are on their way, and the other where calling 911 for help has to be thought about a time or two before making the call, because they know that when officers show up, even if they are the caller, their very lives may be in danger. They may leave in handcuffs themselves, or they may be victims of excessive force. In one America, a dog off leash at a public beach in violation of signs and rules, a white woman would be told by the lifeguard to put her dog on the leash and the police would not be called at all. In the other America, where it is a Black woman in Ocean Beach with an unleashed dog, Not only does the police get called by the lifeguard, but when the police come, there are several of them, and they yell at her on a crowded beach, saying things like, "You with the red hair," as she's running down the beach. Bystanders note that other non-Black people have dogs in the area without a leash, and they aren't being treated that way, and start to film. The officers body slam the young Black woman onto the ground 3 times, a time before the camera started rolling. In the process of falsely arresting her, they expose her breast and do nothing to cover her. They even kick her dog as they put her into the police car and take her to jail. In this America, 911 and police officers are weaponized against the Black community, and this has been the norm. And this is why I filed a claim against the city of San Diego on her behalf. In this America, there is no equity in enforcement. And this is why we see that Black San Diegans received a quarter of all coronavirus-related citations, as the Voice of San Diego pointed out in a new report. Their analysis of the San Diego Police Department crime data shows that Black San Diegans make up nearly 24% of all coronavirus-related offenses, despite being about 6.5% of the population. On May 31st, San Diego Police Department officers fired tear gas and rubber bullets into a crowd of peaceful protesters without giving notice of a dispersal order, how much time they had to disperse, the consequences of failing to disperse, or even an exit route. And they did so where there was no danger of a riot, disorder, or interference with traffic, or any other immediate threat to public safety. And yet they caused physical, bodily injury, emotional trauma, and psychological damage. And they did all this in direct violations of the right to peacefully protest that is recognized by our federal and our state constitutions. Instead of officers honoring this long recognized and sacred right to peacefully protest and assemble and lift voices, they cause an immense amount of physical, emotional, and psychological trauma and injury. And this is why I filed claims against the city of San Diego on behalf of peaceful protesters who are being represented by my organization, MOGO. This collaboration that you see today among civil rights attorneys is significant because it challenges the notion that the problems we see in our policing system are a result of bad apples. Very clearly, we are showing that the problems are systemic and run deep. Through our clients' cases, we are making a case for the need for transformative justice in our policing practices. Joining together as lawyers who see this violence altogether too often, we join an even bigger chorus calling for the immediate ban on the use of so-called less lethal force being used against protesters, community members. Things like the beanbags that we heard about earlier, chemical weapons such as tear gas being used on protesters who are only exercising their constitutional rights. We're happy to see AB 66 be introduced at the state level. We don't want more performative gestures. We are calling for transformative justice because that is what we need, and that is what we need right now. We are asking for a reimagining of our police departments and our law enforcement agencies across the county and the role that they play in our communities. And this includes policies that are contained in CPAT's Police Accountability Now package. PROTECT is the first policy in our package, and PROTECT stands for Preventing Over-Policing Through Equitable Community Treatment. PROTECT is a law that will ban consent searches and stops and end pretext stops. Research and internal data of our local police agencies show that these discretionary stops are used disproportionately in Black and Brown communities, and this law will reduce police presence in Black and Brown communities. We also call for decriminalizing low-level offenses and investing in non-law enforcement interventions by divesting from the police budget. A big part of the problem is the broadening scope and responsibilities given to law enforcement agencies, which lead to the disproportionate use of force against Black people and the killing of Black people. Again, going back to the young woman who walked her dog off leash at Ocean Beach. This is a very minor offense, but she was again physically abused and harmed at the hands of police officers. And let us not forget Aaliyah Jenkins, who was a passenger along with another Black passenger in a car driven by a Black male, stopped by SDPD in La Jolla as a result of expired registration. This should have ended with the citation, but it ended with Ms. Jenkins being placed into custody for a warrant for a minor offense relating to a smoking offense that wasn't even hers, but her twin sister's. And she lost her life at the hands of officers who ignored her calls for help as they traveled through traffic from La Jolla down to the precinct. I often wonder, and I think about how it would have been different, how her death could have been prevented, and how it should have been prevented. I think about how if she wasn't a Black person in a car with other Black passengers in that particular neighborhood, would she have ever been pulled over at all? Or even if they had gotten pulled over, would they have just been given a ticket for the expired tags? Would there have been a check on the people and the passengers to find a warrant that didn't even belong to her? We know that misdemeanor offenses comprise the vast majority of arrests by SDPD and the San Diego Sheriff's Department. 71% of all SDPD arrests and 67% of all SD sheriff arrests were for misdemeanors. Police should not be first responders to mental health and homelessness issues, among other things. One only needs to look at the Alfred Alongo case in El Cajon to understand this. We shouldn't criminalize people experiencing homelessness. As my very first act as the executive director of MOGO, I sent a letter to San Diego's mayor and police chief with recent citations attached for things like illegal lodging and sleeping in the park as exhibits. CPAT's Police Accountability Now package also recommends an independent, community-led oversight board with true powers. And as Mr. Marinan just talked about, we absolutely need to come out and vote for this in full measure in November. The city of San Diego was already leading this conversation, but other cities and all cities in our county need to follow suit. It is not enough for San Diego alone to have this model, as we can see with the incidents in La Mesa. We also recommend very strong and robust use of force and de-escalation policies. As many of the speakers before me have mentioned, we need transformative change, we need cultural change, and we have got to do things better on the policing front, or we will never have the trust between community members and law enforcement that so many of us want so very badly. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Genevieve Jones-Wright and all of the outstanding speakers. Just go over protocols for Q&A very quickly. Before asking a question, please provide your name and media outlet. We'll be using the Zoom raise hand and Q&A features, taking questions as they come in, first come, first serve. If you join us by video, use the hand raising feature or the Zoom Q&A feature. Either click on the icon labeled raise hand, and then to lower the hand, click the same button now labeled lower hand. The Q&A moderator will unmute you at that point and acknowledge, and then you can ask the question and be placed back on mute. You can raise your hand again for a follow-up question. If you want to use the Q&A feature, click on the icon labeled Q&A on the bottom of the screen, type your question in the window, and then it will be read aloud and turned over to the appropriate panelist to respond. If you're on the phone, use the hand raising feature, raise and lower virtual hand by dialing *9, and we'll follow the same process. As our communications director pointed out, panelists, turn on video for Q&A, please.
Hi there, this is Melissa Don with NBC7 San Diego. This is a question for the ACLU. Essentially, obviously, we're following the incidents that inspired the protests in the first place in La Mesa. In addition to George Floyd, it was the treatment received by Omari Johnson. What are your concerns from that incident, from the conduct of La Mesa PD, and whether you think the scrutiny will force a cultural change in the department?
I'll respond briefly by saying I share the concerns of all of the speakers today, that law enforcement has a systemic pattern of excessive and abusive and unnecessary force in response to protests and otherwise, and especially against Black people and communities of color. And it's necessary to reduce and direct resources away from law enforcement into community care, into community service, and away from punishment and criminalization. I'll turn it over to the speakers to address in turn. I'll start with Ms. Jones-Wright and let her respond to that briefly as well.
I did fail to mention that I also filed a claim on behalf of a young man against the city of La Mesa. We know that the recent actions of La Mesa police officers as it relates to Omari Johnson was not just a one-off. We had been to La Mesa Police Department, I would say about 2 years ago, when there was the situation with the La Mesa police officer who was campus police at Helix Charter, who had gotten physically aggressive with a young lady who was a student at the time. I stood with Mr. Johnson at a press conference along with Mr. Pride, and we were very shocked and concerned regarding the language that La Mesa city officials, including the mayor and the police chief, used during their initial press conference. And what we knew to be true then is what we now really know to be true now as a result of the dismissal of Omari Johnson's charges in his criminal case, is that there was absolutely no reason for that officer to make contact with Mr. Johnson that day as he sat waiting for his friends to come home as he had instructed the officer. This was a very clear case of racial profiling. It is not an isolated case. And the claim that was filed on behalf of the other young man, who is another young African-American young man, also involved Officer Dadges, the same officer with Omari Johnson. What is very significant about today is that hearing the cases, hearing about these incidents from different civil rights attorneys across San Diego shows the need for systemic change, as these are all system-wide problems. And we can't look at one police agency and say they're the only agency that needs change. And we also can't settle for stopping at the ban of the carotid restraint that should have been banned ages ago, as Mr. Marinan talked about. We can't stop at other low-hanging fruit and other performative gestures. Now is the time for us to have transformative justice that will only come through sweeping changes so that we can have the changes we need in the system all across the county.
We're open to questions in the Q&A or hand-raising features if there are any from the press.
Yeah, hi, this is Adam Rakusin with Channel 10 News here. I'm curious, combined, I know Dante, you'd mentioned a couple claims that had been filed, Gerald and Genevieve. Do you know how many total combined claims have been filed in the past several weeks regarding the different incidents that have taken place? And just if you could talk a little bit about just kind of what each of the claims allege, or at least what you're filing them under.
I'll ask Mr. Pride, then Mr. Singleton, then Ms. Jones-Wright to respond in turn. But I will say also, please feel free to follow up with the various local agencies, La Mesa, San Diego City, San Diego County, and ask them about the number of claims, because they're the ones who are getting the claims. But Mr. Pride, please go ahead.
As of now, my office has filed 4 claims. for 4 different individuals. We do and are investigating multiple other claims, specifically related to Officer Dadgis. I've received multiple calls from other individuals who were impacted by Officer Dadgis during his time at the Lamesa Police Department. I do believe he's still there, but he shouldn't be. So 4 claims. The claims that we are moving forward with are violation of constitutional rights, 1st, 8th, 4th, 14th Amendment. And we also are potentially going to move forward with Bain Act claims under California Civil Code 52.1. So that's where we're at.
Okay, Mr. Singleton and Ms. Jones-Wright, then I'll ask Ms. Yu and Mr. Marion too.
Certainly. Yeah, to follow up on what Dante said, our office has filed 4 tort claims, and all of them allege violation of the 4th Amendment, use of excessive force. So here are people that are complying with the law, exercising their First Amendment rights, and have excessive force used against them in violation of the 4th Amendment. And then also, as Dante said, California has its own civil rights statute, the Bain Act, which we are working right now to try and improve, to bring it more in line with the federal, but it's also a tool that we use. Then we filed 2 separate complaints, which are designed to prevent the city of San Diego, the city of La Mesa from using rubber bullets and tear gas as crowd control. And then the final thing that I wanted to address, Genevieve touched on this and Dante did as well, is that one of the things you see over and over again, and we saw this most, I think, profoundly with Derek Chauvin in Minnesota, the officer who killed George Floyd, who I believe had 17 complaints against him in his 19 years on the force. But as both Dante and Genevieve said, you see an officer here who has repeated complaints against him, and they're allowed to get away with it. And that goes back to something that Mike Marinon said, which is that this is part of the culture, that what happens is you have otherwise good officers, but they allow bad officers to get away with violating people's rights. And because of that, you never see the kind of systemic change that we need. So I think that's an important point, and hopefully that's one of the things that we'll be able to change.
Ms. Jones-Wright, please.
I filed 4 total claims this week, but we are receiving lots of calls, just as the Pride law firm is receiving a lot of calls from other protesters and other community members who have been wronged by on-duty and uniformed officers, not just in San Diego, but also La Mesa. Our claims assert the same injuries that Mr. Singleton and Mr. Pride just spoke of. I also filed claims that related to false arrests, as there were 2 claimants who were falsely arrested in addition to suffering physical injury, emotional injury, and also property loss and damage. And so those things are also a part of the claims.
Okay, Ms. Yu.
So we are continuing to file claims against the county for its consistent and continuing mistreatment of detainees, resulting in serious injuries or deaths. But most recently, we will be filing on behalf of Ms. Kathleen Bills, the mother of Nicholas Bills, who was shot in the back and killed by a sheriff's deputy, Aaron Russell, for wrongful death.
And Mr. Marinon.
I think, like everybody else, I've been getting a lot of calls from protesters and investigating and looking at filing claims. 2 things that I think are worth mentioning. One is there's the injuries that happen out during the protest. I'm looking at a case now where a man was shot in the back of the head with one of the beanbag rounds. But I've heard from several people about the treatment that people suffered at the San Diego Stadium, at Qualcomm Stadium. Apparently that's where they took people, particularly at the end of May. And this is what I heard from them is, in the midst of COVID, everybody's thrown in this huge cage, literally a cage. No bathrooms, no water. People are still in handcuffs, and so many of the people are cuffed in a manner that is causing excruciating pain. And I think all of us see this all the time. It's a form of street justice that officers often do. It's wrong and it's illegal, period, no matter who's being arrested. And one fellow was telling me about, there were grown men in this cage literally crying because of the pain that they were in from cuffs, and there's officers and deputies right outside just laughing at them and not providing water to people who had been pepper sprayed and tear gassed. And that's not being allowed to use the bathroom. And there's no reason for any of that. It's just this attitude of, we can treat people without any type of dignity or respect. And that's just plain unacceptable, and it happens far too frequently. The other thing is, it is very common that when we look at a case of excessive force, and in my experience, shootings, it is surprisingly common that the officer involved has done it before. In other words, if there's 2,000 approximately San Diego police officers, something a little short of that with deputies, and you get a shooting where an officer shot and killed someone, statistically, the odds of that officer having fired his gun before should be very small, but they're not. Most officers go through their whole career never having fired their gun. We see repeat offenders. Over the years I've been doing this work, I've sued the same cops more than once for excessive force and sometimes shootings. And so what that tells us is, the officers who are problematic are not being held accountable. They're not being even looked at. The departments are listening to their story. He reached for his waistband. I feared for my life. Those are the stories that we've all heard, case after case after case, until now. Some of them are on video, and we can see for ourselves what the truth is. So I think that's part of the what needs to change, is the idea of accountability. And sometimes it is absolutely clear that one incident is enough, and it should tell a chief or a sheriff, this person does not have the temperament to be a police officer. And a skilled police administrator can see that. And when that happens, a good chief will tell that officer, you're not going to be on the street again. Period. End of story. You don't have the right judgment. So that's something that we see very, very rarely. The same guys go back out and do it again.
Thank you very much. I'll just wrap up by saying, my offices continue to receive a number of intakes and calls, and we've heard numerous concerns about all the problems that my colleagues have identified. And along with MOGO and all of the excellent litigators in this call, we are very open to hearing from the community. And as I said before, my office has created a dedicated intake line specifically for community concerns with law enforcement. And that information is available on our website, and our communications team can let you know that. There was also a question in the Q&A, will we have a speaker in Spanish? Unfortunately, I apologize, we don't have a speaker in this press conference scheduled to present in Spanish. But if you follow up with my office's communications department, they can connect you with either somebody on this call or another person who can provide an interview in Spanish if necessary.
David, it looks like there was one more question.
Sure. That was the question. We have another question from a participant, please. Is it David Hernandez?
Yeah, that's right. I'm David Hernandez with the Union Tribune. So I'm just curious if any of the speakers on this call have had any sort of productive conversations with law enforcement or elected leaders about well, one topic in particular that was discussed, the use of what law enforcement calls less than lethal options. We've seen in other cities that they have moved forward with limiting and sometimes banning these projectile weapons, but I wonder if, I mean, I haven't really heard from law enforcement about their particular stance, so I wonder if anyone on this call has had any productive conversations with elected leaders or law enforcement leaders.
Yeah, I'll turn that over to Ms. Jones-Wright to kick it off and let others follow up if they have additional thoughts.
So as a coalition, CPAC convenes a meeting with local mayors all across the county, as well as city council members from all across the county to talk about the Police Accountability Now package. We have made it a priority to speak with all elected and public officials to talk about the need for these policies and not to do a piecemeal type of implementation. We have also committed to continue the meetings with local electeds, again, all over the county, because we cannot concentrate in simply one city alone. That doesn't make San Diegans safe. And things like the independent community-led commission has to be implemented as the model for every single city, just as the San Diego County Grand Jury recommended in at least 2 reports that I've read. So we have been meeting with elected officials. We were happy to see that Assembly Member Lorena Gonzalez has introduced AB 66 that deals with the very issue you talked about, Mr. Hernandez, with the use of the projectiles and also chemical weapons that will be banned so that those things will no longer happen. That would set the minimum across the state for police agencies for what they can use against protesters. And I believe that that legislation is very important. We are continuing the conversation at all levels, statewide, all the way to the municipal level. And we have committed to continue doing that until we see the change.
Do we have any other thoughts from the panelists on top of that excellent summary?
Yeah, just very briefly, Genevieve is 100% right. It's got to be done on a systemic level. But David, to answer your question about the specific suits that we've brought regarding the less than lethal, we have not had any response yet from any of the agencies or public entities involved.
Just lastly, if I could add to that, there's a bill that has been introduced. It's AB 1197 that addresses chokeholds, other maneuvers that prevent the airway of the neck. The chiefs of police had originally decided that they were going to back it, but they have reversed course now because of the addition of the language regarding compression deaths. So that is their official position, is that they oppose that bill, AB 1197.
So we're at 1 hour now. If there are any further questions, we remain open either through Q&A or the chat function or raising hands. Just let us know. If we have no further questions, going once, going twice, I will conclude the press conference and thank you all very much. Thank you to my colleagues and panelists. Thank you to the ACLU communications team. Thank you to the press for covering this important issue. Thank you all for your engagement. If there are any follow-up questions, or again, if to discuss whether we have Spanish language speakers available, I'm sure we can make that happen. Please contact Ed Cifuentes, our senior media and communications strategist. His number is 619-300-6166, or his email is ecifuentes@aclusandiego.org. Again, his number 619-300-6166. And thank you all again very much.